Hello, and welcome to the Todd and Taylor Show, another episode of Coffee and Comics. I'm Todd A.
I'm Taylor Trask.
It's Taylor Trask. Good morning, Taylor.
Morning, Todd. This is turning into click and clack, the car talk. Like, I worry that at some point we're just going to be the car talk guys or an NPR. Where we're just like, and Todd, I can't believe it's another beautiful morning here at Denver. Like,
hey, if we get those big NPR dollars.
Yeah. Well, apparently the click and clack guys, like, I think they film or they tape in Boston, and their like studio is really well known. It's like, that's where they do it. Like, it's kind of like Boston's, Prairie Home Companion. It's like, that's where that happens. We should all respect and behold the more click and clack is recorded. I don't think they record there anymore. I think the show is over. But when it was happening, it was there.
Right.
Anywho. It's neither here nor there.
We are recording from our respective homes in California and Colorado.
That's right.
We are legitimately recording this in the morning when we would be drinking coffee. What coffee are you drinking today, Taylor?
Well, Todd, this morning I'm drinking a small latte from the fine folks at Dunkin' Donuts. After last week's sort of like, very, very indie pick, I figured I would, because both my pick in terms of my comic or my graphic novel last week and my coffee were very, very indie and sophisticated. I feel that my picks this week are a little more mainstream, so I wanted a little bit more of a mainstream drink to accompany that. How about you?
I love it. Well, after last week and my very Philistine pick of Starbucks, I went out and bought myself some ground coffee. I thought, I'm going to wake up this morning. I'm going to go through that process of making iced coffee myself. As you know, I don't drink hot coffee. That's the devil's temperature. So I bought a great house blend from Pete's. Looked at the Italian roast, but decided on this one. And then about 11:15 last night, realized I didn't have any milk. So this morning I woke up and I drove to Starbucks and got an iced coffee. Could have walked, to the store and gotten some milk, but I was like, ugh, I got to come back and make this stuff.
See, exactly. There's that thing that happens where you're like, oh man. And I have actually, full confession, I have actually gone to the grocery store when I was out of milk or cream or what have you, gone to the grocery store, and instead of buying the milk, I went to the Starbucks in the grocery store to just buy a latte and go, I'll deal with this later. Because by that point, you're like, I just need the caffeine now. I can't mess with
Yeah, for sure. Or you do that where you buy the coffee in the store, like, this is today's, but I'm also going to get the milk and the grounds for tomorrow.
Yeah.
I'll do it myself tomorrow. But today, I got to have the infusion of caffeine.
That's right.
Should we jump into these books?
Let's do, because last week had a lot of fun talking about Pyongyang, and what was your pick, Todd?
Rocket Girl.
And this week, and we're going to keep with the tradition that we're not going to tell each other the choices ahead of time. So both Todd and I are coming into this completely blind, which is going to be fun, where I will be just as sort of surprised by the choice as you, dear listener, and likewise. So let's start with you, though, this time. What have you for us this week?
Well, not too far off the beaten path that we like to tread, which is Image Comics. I'm talking about Paper Girls Volume 3.
Oh, there we go. We referenced Paper Girls in your review of Rocket Girl last week, so I was hoping sooner or later this would come up.
Yeah, and actually, so that was what inspired it. Really, was I thought, let's jump into another comic that talks about the 80s and like takes place in the 80s. That on listening back to our podcast, really enjoyed our conversation about like, why are all these people revisiting the 80s, and what's significant about that. And I there were a couple things that came up where I thought, oh, this is just going to tie in perfectly with Paper Girls. We talked about it with Rocket Girl, where a time traveling teenage cop goes back from 2013 to 1986. And you asked very good questions about, like, did it have to be in the 80s in that specific year? And there's a point that we were both kind of dancing around, and you brought up the movie Adventureland. And it made, in reading Paper Girls Volume 3 this week, it really made the point to me that there are a lot of this 80s revisitation is just because that's when the artists and creators grew up, and that's they're just going to set a story about childhood in the decade in which they were children. And we'd also talked about Stranger Things, and I was saying that Stranger Things to me is almost like they're going to tell a weird sci-fi story, but set it so perfectly within the 80s. And the
Mhm.
way I kind of distinguished Adventureland and Stranger Things, correct me if I'm wrong, or at least tell me your opinion on this, because I'd love to hear it, is I think sometimes we revisit a decade in art in order to tell a story that's sort of unique to that time period.
Mhm.
And like we're telling a story about that time period. And then sometimes it really is just sort of the set dressing, you
Mhm.
know? And one of the great takeaways I had from Mad Men was, although they do tell a lot of micro stories about the 60s, the overall, story of Mad Men was I related to so much stuff from Mad Men just from my work in, digital agencies and stuff. I
Yeah.
went, oh my God, this is like timeless wisdom. So to me, the 60s was really just the setting of that show to tell human stories and business stories that are relatable over any decade. And
Yeah.
and that's kind of how I see Stranger Things, is like this is a sci-fi story that legitimately could have taken place in any decade, and they set it in the 80s, and they really perfected that, that look of the 80s, and that um every all the details about the 80s were in there, which just drew you into the universe even more. But it wasn't really a story about the 80s. Obviously, it was sci-fi. Whereas Adventureland, I think, might actually just be a story about the 80s.
Hmm.
And so they
It's
kind of
in-
tried to nail the 80s for that reason.
it's interesting because I would actually flip it. I think
Oh,
Adventureland is more a story that's kind of universal. Now, yeah, the platform to tell that story, the amusement park, 1987, all of that is good window dressing. But I feel like that story is a good relationship story that could have occurred just as easily in 2012. It doesn't have
yeah.
to be 87. Whereas with Stranger Things, I feel like Stranger Things is almost like an auteur film or something from the 70s where yeah, you could separate that story from the time period, but so much of that time period is necessary for that story. The kids have
Right.
to be out on bikes. There has to be sort of a spooky kind of quality to it. And you can't just call
Oh,
somebody on their
man.
cell phone immediately. You can't,
Yeah.
people can't be as available. Like there's not drones flying through the sky trying to find a missing kid or something. And even like,
Dang.
the
You-
cliches of like Barb being upset, like the characters that we see, especially on the older kids, like they all fit a certain stereotype that is very much of a product of that time. So yeah, it's homaging that time, but it also has to exist there for the story to be anywhere as good or as cogent as we find it.
Great points.
There's one.
So
Well,
I think I've overthought the evidence to try to cram it into my position.
but you can almost take it one step further. I finally, coincidentally, last night watched start to finish the Black Mirror episode San Junipero, which is had just won the Emmy for like best TV movie. And it is very much, it's one of those Black Mirror episodes that I had kind of skipped over because the way it starts is a little slow and muddy. And I just was kind of like, I don't really need this. I sat down, I watched it start to finish. It is probably the best Black Mirror episode that has ever existed. I'm so glad I stuck with it because it goes in some pretty interesting directions. But again, the sort of the platform of the 1980s is so essential. Yeah, it's a love story, but you need the iconography, you need the music. That soundtrack is key to that story being told the way it has. There's a certain nostalgia that they bake in. There, a lot of like beach at night scenes that are very reminiscent of the 80s, and like so much of that flow has to happen then. And then there's a kind of a contemporary modern day B story that goes alongside it, that you need the 80s, the retroness and sort of the nature of it to juxtapose against kind of the current the characters in their current situation. So that straight up, if you haven't seen that San Junipero episode or you've been holding off, go see it. I was resistant to it. I'm so glad I jumped in. But I wonder,
so I will check it out.
But to take this back to Paper Girls, do you feel that Paper Girls could have easily been a story from 1996, like, or the 50s if they decided to make it then? Would it have worked as well?
They could have adapted the major themes for certain, but it had to start in the past at some point because so what they're doing is they're able to find artifacts from the future, and they needed to ground the story in a way where they're going to find an artifact that we would recognize in 2016 or 2017 and but would seem so futuristic to someone in 1988. which is where it starts. So, for example, when the girls do travel to 2016, they're confounded by this super flat, super huge television. You know, they're like, there's so many buttons on this remote control. Like, how rich are you? You know, um, and that's just what TVs are like, you know.
Which is funny though, because Back to the Future 2 gave us essentially that, and we're like, oh yeah, and that was supposed to be 2015,
right?
So it was just like, oh yeah, the big, it's flat. Now that was a projector, I think, but they made it seem like it was like a big flat screen TV that Marty McFly was talking into. So it's interesting that they pick and choose kind of like what people from the 80s are shocked by versus what they're not. Like, it's always an interesting thought exercise, you know.
Which is we're seeing it right now this weekend play out with Blade Runner 2049, where I believe the original Blade Runner takes place in 2019, and you see that challenge of, okay, well, if you write a story in 1980 and try to imagine a future that's really only 30 years away, how futuristic do you make it? Or you write a story in your present day, but you go back to the past and you get to look at how futuristic the present is compared to 20 something years in the past, which is what Paper Girls is doing. Rocket Girl is much more in that vein of Blade Runner, where the 2013 in Rocket Girl is way more futuristic than the actual 2013 was. But Paper Girls, they're really able to ground it because in 1988, when they find an artifact with the Apple logo on it that looks like an iPod, which we would recognize as like, oh, that looks like an iPod Shuffle. They can kind of go, well, it's like, recognize the iconography, but they don't know what this tiny little device could be. But then when they future jump to the 2016 and they meet a future version of one of the girls, she knows immediately, like, this is a product from Apple, the computer company. But it is more futuristic than she expects, even though when she pulls out her iPhone and looks for directions, the girls are blown away. Like, what in the hell is that? So I think in this case, they didn't, like you pointed out with Stranger Things, which you're dead right. You're right on the nose. Like, they had to set Paper Girls. It had to start in 1988. So we didn't have those conveniences of everyone carrying a mobile phone, especially a smartphone that could, look up any information in the world on it. They don't have maps with them. They had to be on bikes. There had to be an element of danger and fear that they can't contact their parents immediately. So they needed all those things to make that setting work, like that initial kickoff to the whole story. And the whole story in volume 1 kicks off at like 4 a.m. on November 1st, 1988. So as these girls are delivering papers, there's George H.W. Bush, even though nobody called him H.W. at that time. There's George Bush, Bush 88, like campaign signs in lawns and stuff, because the election would have been a week later. And it is significantly, this would be Halloween night. So Halloween is like just taken place. It's 4 a.m. on November 1st. So all the older teenagers who are out causing mischief are out there sort of terrorizing the neighborhood. So the girls are already like on guard, like, what's going on? These older teenagers are going to be out here trying to hassle us and just generally harass them because they're 12-year-old girls delivering papers. So it starts off with that fear, and then they run into and I think to some extent you and I are really trying to talk in detail about all these books, but not in a spoilery way. So I'm really going to try to stay away from spoilers, because definitely my perspective is, if what we're talking about interests you, please go read it, because I don't want to spoil it at all. Like, I'm not assuming anyone's read it. But these girls pretty quickly stumble into some science fiction sort of machine, whether it's a spacecraft or it's a time machine or it's just some sort of portal or something. It's a big, weird piece of, science fiction looking equipment that they can't explain in the basement of a house. And there are these sort of weird people that they've spotted on their route as they're chasing down some of the teenage boys who've stolen a walkie-talkie. And these people have their their faces are covered and stuff. So they assume they're in Halloween costume, but they soon turn out, to discover they do not look like the human beings of our time and planet. And pretty quickly, the girls find themselves in this really strange time traveling thing, which we talked about on our last episode with Rocket Girl. And obviously, we've alluded to it in just this introduction about this. In Paper Girls, the time travel rules are, if I can describe this correctly, that time is sort of a fourth dimension, like a line that they can break through that dimension and then enter again, but they will always remain in the same place. So, in other words, they are always in Cleveland in this spot, which is basically Marty McFly at the Twin Pines Mall.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned this, because one of my largest complaints about time travel in fiction has always been that it kind of too many people think that time travel is just like, oh, we're still here, when time and space, it's basically time and space travel, because you can't say, hey, in 24 hours we're going to travel to 1955. In 1954, we're going to travel 24 hours into the future. Let's just say in 24 hours, the Earth is not going to be where it currently is. And actually, you wind up in like open space and die.
You nailed it. That's the detail I left out. They explain that in Paper Girls. One of the futuristic time travelers explains that if you jump back a week, the Earth is not in the same place. So it is time and space travel. And yeah, that was what a great catch you just made for not having read this. And I've read it and didn't really explain that very well.
Well, there's a documentary, not documentary. There's a short film, little animated short film on Netflix called World of Tomorrow. And it's this, if you've seen it in your queue, it's kind of like stick drawings, but so the animation is really just primitive, but the story is so good because it's about this girl, this little 5-year-old girl who, the third generation of her cloned reaches back like 150 years through time to like communicate with her, early version of herself. But when they're talking about time travel, she very specifically says, time travel is very, very risky and dangerous because you could wind up, in the middle, floating in space like so many people do. You could wind up literally crushed under the Earth's surface because you didn't pinpoint it correctly, or you could just wind up 100,000 years ago and die, by a saber-toothed tiger or something. So just this idea that time travel is always, with the exception of Doctor Who, which is why I like Doctor Who so much, because space is always an element of the travel that occurs. It's always bugged me that so many things, Back to the Future included, never bring that point up. Like, hey, we have to coordinate like exactly where the Earth is going to be at exactly that time. And we could be even 10 feet off the street. We have to be exactly right here. So I'm glad Paper Girls actually, leans into that a little bit, explains that, fleshes that out. That immediately gives me, as a reader, I'm like, okay, good. Oh, good. They're thinking through everything,
Right. Yeah. And it's, I think that too gives it a better, I mentioned last week, I sometimes walk into time travel stories with a little apprehension of, oh, what's their twist going to be, because I'm not so much interested in like getting the science as believable as possible, even though that's very interesting. You got to have something more, and Paper Girls, I think it's, especially at the time when I started reading it, definitely could seem sort of derivative of other contemporary works, especially like Saga and maybe even Sex Criminals, of which I've only read the first volume, but just some of those image kind of tropes where when they encounter, like, basically in that first volume. So I'm not spoiling anything, but they kind of quickly encounter like two groups of people possibly from the future, who are obviously in some sort of conflict. And the one that is in uniform and looks sort of like soldiers or something, they have this way of speaking, which is very much, a lot of it comes like there's what do I want to say? There's a dialect like that in Saga where certain people talk with this, specific kind of dialect. And that's sort of how these people talk. Like you can understand these words, the syllables that they're using sort of run together into different words and things like that. But if you read it all as one big sound, you'll hear the English sounds in it. So you as a reader can read it. And then there's another group that will just speak in symbols and nobody can you can't understand what that is until they're wearing like a translation device. So I don't want to dwell too long on the overall story of Paper Girls because specifically, I wanted to talk about the third volume, which just came out like a month ago or so. And it is one of those where, the first one hooked me, and the second volume went to, at the end of the first volume, as you mentioned last week, there's always this WTF moment at the end of the first volume. There's always a cliffhanger kind of thing.
Mhm.
And second volume opens on where that cliffhanger left off, where the girls are in 2016 encountering the future version of one of themselves.
Whoa.
So they drop through the folding, which is kind of the dimensional rift, which lets them jump in time. And they land in the middle of a street, and this car screeches to a stop, and it's like, kids, get off the road. And they say, no, my name is Aaron Ting, and I'm a paper girl. And the woman gets out of the car and is like, is this some kind of joke? I'm Aaron Ting.
Whoa, interesting.
And I used to be a paper girl, and what the hell's going on? So there's that. So then the second volume is pretty much, it's all in 2016. So it's all sort of the contemporary story. And then volume 3 is where I feel like, we finally got into something where it really stretched out and went, it went in a different direction that I didn't necessarily expect. And I was very much invested in this whole story, because it was all, it wasn't just the back and forth between contemporary, future, and past of one person, I guess. Even though there's so much to say about Paper Girls, but this one was great. They went way back in the past, and they encounter a woman who looks to be about their own age, yet she has a child. And luckily one of them has stolen a translation device from one of these future beings. So they're able to put the translator device on this woman, and can understand what she's saying to them. And so they're in this, primitive, prehistoric time. And at the same time, the person who invented time travel has also landed in this place.
Interesting.
And so the cover, which I'd seen, when I guess maybe at Comic-Con, they released this. They did like sort of a pre-release at Comic-Con this year. And I did not pick it up there. And they got it at my local comic book shop, but the cover has these two women, the one future one and the one prehistoric one. But it's easy to look at the cover and think, oh, wow, are these like future versions of two of the Paper Girls, because you can kind of impose their characteristics on it. So granted, I've spoiled that a little bit, but that
just makes me more interested, because like as soon as you bring that into play, let me just ask you this. Do the future versions of themselves remember the events of their former selves? Like, do they remember meeting themselves when they were young?
Yeah. I mean, without getting too, well, I don't think it's spoilery. No.
Okay. And see, that's interesting.
In that moment in volume 2. Yeah. In that moment in volume 2, where the young Aaron Ting has to prove to the current, present day Aaron Ting, who she is. She said, the older one is like, oh, well, what, I can't remember. She's like, what was the nickname of your goldfish that you never told anybody? What was this? And then the young Aaron Ting goes, well, what about this? And she lifts her shirt up, and there's a scar, which we have seen her get in volume 1.
Mm-hmm.
And present day Aaron Ting has that same scar and has no idea how she got it. So
interesting.
So they tell her, and that there's this very weird, like, how did these things happen to me? And I don't remember them.
But wait, I'm going to cry bullshit just a little bit, because at some point I could easily see that, hey, younger you may not know what older you is going to look like. So running into your older self may be like, oh, that's me. You know what you look like when you were that age. Wouldn't at any, like if the 12-year-old Todd came up to you and was like, hey, I'm Todd, wouldn't you be like, oh yeah, of course you are. Like, I know exactly what you look like.
I think they actually play that off in a really good way. Like you definitely got that feeling that she recognizes her, and she's in the clothes that she would have worn in 1988. And then additionally, later in that volume, her younger present day sister meets the 1988 version, and she recognizes her immediately. And
Mhm.
she's like, oh my gosh, it's my big sister as a little person. Like, this is amazing.
Well, what I love about this is it plays with I mean, you kind of get a little Flight of the Navigator with this, right? Which is another 80s staple, which they're coincidentally
Which
random
I have
subject.
seen.
Well, and they're actually remaking it. They're going to reboot it, which I have mixed feelings on. But
Yeah.
nevertheless, Flight of the Navigator, a staple. They could put that on Netflix right now, and I'm sure launch it with season 2 of Stranger Things. It would probably get tons and tons and tons of views because it's kind of become that sort of, for anybody who was a kid in the 80s, Flight of the Navigator is clearly in like one of your favorite movie lists. That to be said, the whole crux of that movie is the main character, the boy, goes forward in time 7 years.
Oh,
So
right. Yeah.
his brother,
Course.
his younger like jerk of a little brother, is now mature and in high school and actually has to help his quote unquote bigger older brother get back home to his timeline. So
Right.
and then he sees his parents and they did a really great job of showing like what would his parents look like, not only older but after years of stress from losing their son without any explanation. Like there's so much about that. So I love that. It seems like Paper Girls was set out. They're like, we're going to honor all the stuff from the 80s we like, but that also includes a lot of the story threads that we always sort of dug, and I really like that. Let me ask you this. So volume 1 was set, takes place mainly in the 80s, correct?
Yeah, right.
Volume 2 is 2016. Volume 3, now do they go back and forth, or are they still stuck in 2016?
Yeah, it's all, no. Volume 3 is all the prehistoric story.
Okay.
Yeah. All the way to the end. So basically every episode is going to end with them jumping through what they call the folding, which is, like one of these tears in the fourth dimension where they can sort of leap into another time. And the device that they find in the first volume that has the Apple insignia on it is sort of this futuristic iPhone that can, pair with a user. It knows them sort of biologically in some way. So it doesn't work for them until they meet the Erin Ting of 2016. And then as an adult, it recognizes her voice and some biometric thing. And then she is able to see things that we don't see and the girls don't see, where she's like, yeah, it's just showing me a map. And it says, here's the fourth folding and here's the fifth folding. And they sort of follow these clues to get to those foldings and then jump. And so, the end of, more or less the end of every issue is them going through a folding in some way. And, the cliffhanger is them finding themselves in another time with some strange circumstance and trying to figure out what's going on.
So this definitely is one of those, because a lot of graphic novels I really like, Postal is a great example. They feel like TV shows that have just been serialized in graphic novel form. So like this could, in your opinion, could this just as easily work as a 7-part series on HBO or Netflix?
Oh yeah, I think it's sometimes. Sometimes it's. I read it thinking, is that what they're going for? Like, are they just hoping this gets picked up? But I really, that's cynical. I really don't think that's the case. I think comic creators make comics because that's what comic creators do.
No,
and
definitely.
This is how they're going to tell that story. But there is another comic we brought up last week, which, part of what we talked about last week was how Image does these great trade paperback #1 of any series will be cheaper, and then they'll do these online sales where they're just totally a steal for like $5 or something. So it's easy they're really trying to hook people with that, And one that I really like that you did not is Black Science. I think you read volume 1 and then kind of bailed out, or maybe you didn't even get through volume 1. Black Science is I like Black Science. Like, it has, the art is really different. It's really sharp. It's comic booky, but it's not at all like superhero or something. It's just, but I don't care about the characters. And now they're 6, maybe 7 volumes into it, and I don't sense an arc to the whole thing. So reading Paper Girls 3, I realized like, what's really cool is that the way that they handled the character development through these and just sort of the character moments, because it's all just like a chase or escape, basically, so there's not a lot of time for character development, but the way they handle those character moments, where the girls talk about their parents, or one time, we do see a parent in one scene, and then the Erin meets her future self and her sister, and the way they handle those moments, I found myself really caring, like, oh, I want to know more about these girls and what is going to happen to them. Whereas in Black Science, it's like about a bunch of awful people who are jumping through different dimensions and ruining their current dimension with every jump. And it gets to where you're like, this is just a disaster. Like, just wrap this up, man. Redeem these people or end them, like into the story or something. So that season, that feeling of like every trade is a different season, like every volume is a different season of a TV series or episode or something. It can kind of cut both ways. So I do sort of hope that there is an overall arc to Paper Girls and that it will wrap up, because I don't really want to, I don't think this can sustain for very long. We can't have these 12-year-old girls just jumping in time, for 12 volumes or something. Like,
well, it's interesting it's interesting you compare it to Black Science, because Black Science, the reason I didn't get into it is I just wasn't a fan of that art style. I mean, I'm sure as good as it is, it just doesn't jive with me. And one of the chief reasons I can't quite get into Paper Girls is I just can't wrap my head around the art style, which is fittingly very much like they are paper doll, sort of the way they draw the girls is very paper doll-esque, right? Like the way they're sort of juxtaposed against the backgrounds. There's like a lot of heavy, dark lines, and it just sort of has that quality. Do you get that sense?
Yeah, I think, and I'm sitting here flipping through all 3 volumes as you're saying that and finding them really consistent. So it's definitely something that I picked up the first volume not loving the art, because you and I talk about that all the time. So like when I picked it up and flipped through it, I wasn't totally sold on the art. Whereas like with Black Science, I didn't even have to find out what the story was. I was like, this art is incredible. I'm buying it.
Yeah.
But this one has definitely grown on me. There is that very like flat kind of 2-dimensional. I mean, obviously they all look 2-dimensional, but there's not an attempt like with Rocket Girl where it's it's more superhero-y, and there's so much like attention to the action that's going on and sort of the muscle movement and all that of the characters, that Rocket Girl ends up looking very 3-dimensional because of the movement. Paper Girls definitely has that very flat feeling of even when there's movement, it's sort of the comic book or the comics in the newspaper style of like a flat panel with like just the gesture of running or something like that.
Yeah. It does have a very fun with Dick and Jane kind of look and feel, right? Like even the way they draw their faces is very reminiscent of like illustrations from the 50s or 60s, which again, I'm sure all of this is intentional. It's all a very deliberate choice. I just particularly, my sensibilities, I just, at this juncture, 10 years from now, I might be like all about it, but at this juncture, I just can't stick with the story with that sort of art right now.
Which is a totally fair assessment. And I think that's a big thing. It's great that you and I talk about that in multiple episodes, that, to us, the art is more important than the story. Because I think that's just an important thing to realize as a comic reader, and that's what helps you find the comics you're really going to respond to is that art, like I don't know. I just feel like don't let anyone tell you that you should suffer through art you don't like because the story's so good. Because to me, I don't know. That's that's the thing that was told to me as a literature student with, just like quote unquote great works of literature, where I think, well, actually, it's just if it's not, if I don't respond to the writing of it, that's sort of the. I can't be held accountable for that. If I don't like the style, then so be it. Like there's another style I'm going to like. It's not like there's just one canon of great literature and that's all there is. It's, there's not just one perfect style of comic book. You respond to what you respond to. So, I think
you can still respect the story or just the intent, even if it's not particular. Like it's just like walking to a museum or a gallery, right?
Yeah.
There's stuff in the gallery that you're like, hey, I'm glad this is here. It's just not my cup of tea right now. And I think one of the things, and it sounds like a broken record, but one of the things that I love so much about the comics and graphic novel medium is that it's much more art, like it's much more art focused than, the writing's important, but it's I would liken it much more to a gallery, like a museum gallery than a bookstore, because
Yeah.
you're seeing all this stuff comes together, and you as a reader can appreciate all of it. Like, I mean, there's so much that someone's like, hey, like, I love this. I'm like, that's great. I'm glad it exists. But as I grow and my sensibilities change and sort of expand, then at some point, the stuff that might seem a little off-putting or scary to me might be really interesting, you know, or vice versa. Or maybe the things I'm into right now may just feel old and limiting, like in 10 years. I'll be really curious to see what my library looks like, or what I come back to, you know, over the next 10, 20 years as time goes on.
Yeah. Yeah, I totally agree. I think that's probably a good place for me to wrap up Paper Girls 3. I think my big takeaway was I realized I'm more invested in the characters than the particulars of the story, I think. Although I do hope that it does not become like endless seasons of them sort of jumping through these different portals. And, you know, I do hope that there is that it's a finite story, you know, with a satisfying ending. But yeah, this was kind of the volume that got me. It's strange too, because, you know, not a lot of details I want to share about that, but it's just strange that the prehistoric story was the one where I was like, oh yeah, I really like what's going on. I think it's just because they fleshed out two of the characters a little bit more that hadn't really been touched on before. And I just felt like, oh yeah, good.
When you'd spent some times with them in a little bit more grounded space. So for them to go a little bit further, it feels more earned, I'm sure. You know, it feels like we get to do this now, and it's not going to be weird or jostling. It's like, oh no, this makes perfect sense now. I'm familiar with everything, so it allows us. Like, they're not just going to go into space right out of the gate.
Right.
They're going to we're going to, just like Stranger Things. Like, we didn't learn too much in that first season. So now that the second season's coming out, like when they start showing us all those crazy visuals of that creature in the sky and all this other stuff, you're like, oh my God, it matters more because we spent so much time grounded for so long. In the context of that story. But like, if they were to do a season 3 and we see some giant, like, close encounter spaceship, you know, fly down, it won't seem weird. It'll be like, oh, we moved naturally into these escalating dangers, you know?
Yeah. Well, and I'll tell you what's important about this too, is that, as much as I appreciate the form of like the trade paperback volume, there is definitely this is the danger that we talk about on our Game of Thrones podcast, of those cliffhangers just not meaning anything if you wait too long to wrap them up, and the sort of tense moments, you know, for different characters. And one of the reasons I probably enjoyed Volume 3 so much is that I'd read Volume 1. When Volume 2 came out, I kind of waited to get it, and then I bought it, and then it sat on my shelf forever, and then I finally read it, absent of Volume 1. Like, I didn't go refresh my memory, you know, I just sort of read it standalone. And so this week when I read Volume 3, I actually went back through Volume 1 and kind of skimmed through, made sure I hit like the right, you know, the major points, and recalled the names and stuff like that, because I knew I'd be talking about it. And so then Volume 2, I ended up rereading almost entirely right before I picked up Volume 3. So when I went into Volume 3, all of these characters and all of their journey so far was fresh in my mind. And it really, like, it was finally where, I think the other big thing is in Volume 3 is where the girls kind of learn the game, and they start figuring out how they can actually help the worlds that they're, you know, or the times that they're jumping into. And that was, I think that's just a big turning point for it. But, you know, whether that's a good thing or a bad thing that you kind of need to sit down and read the volumes back to back. I don't know, you know, it's just tough to go 6 or 8 months or something before you're going to get an update.
That's when there's another, I bring up the series They're Not Like Us, because I can only read that as volumes. Like, the story is such that it has to be consumed in one season, because the individual issues aren't strong enough on their own. Like, you need that they're all so much better when they're collected. And then you're like, that was so fulfilling. But if I had to wait a week in between individual issues, like, it just doesn't work. So then to go from, you know, Volume 1, which came out, I think I bought that last year, or even maybe 2 years ago at this point. No, 2 years ago, and then Volume 2 came out last year. And then now Volume 3 is coming out in November, December. But like, waiting a year in between is, yeah, it's a little, I'm gonna have to go back and reread those first 2 to get myself jazzed back up again. Even though I remember the story, I want to fall back into that world a little bit more and, like, really, you know, remind myself, so that when quote unquote Volume 3 or Season 3 starts, even though the issue's already out there. I feel like I have to consume it that way. But it is a little obnoxious to have to wait. It's just like with anything, waiting for the next season of Game of Thrones or waiting for the next thing, especially when the story is not quite, it leaves you on a cliffhanger that's just like, it gnaws at you for that entire time. So then you run the risk. This is good to point out too, because you run the risk as a creator if you do that too many times, or if you play too freewheeling with that time in between can make that person just go, you know what, I hate this thing. Like the amount of stress I've had to endure waiting for the next chapter, and I think Walking Dead fans can attest to this. It just makes you
George Martin readers.
Exactly. It just makes you go, you know what? I had to move on. Like I had to fill that gap with other stuff that's now more. I prefer more to this other thing. So you got to like really be cognizant of how much time passes. We've beat this to death on any Game of Thrones or GRRM discussion. So yeah. I don't want to go back there,
but I appreciate the way you frame that, because it is something for creators to bear in mind. And it, as much as comics gives you this great medium to tell, like you can think of each volume as more of like a season of a series,
Yeah.
And so it's cool that Paper Girls and many others are arranged in like, the arc of volume 1 is going to take place in this time, in this setting, and the arc of volume 2 is this, and it feels very seasonal and it's very cool. But what's in my head is like, I hope you have an ending and I hope you can wrap this up, is because of things like East of West, another thing we've brought up, where I know I'm interested in that story. Like it has and the art has everything. It has so much going for it that appeals to me, but they're so deep into it now that I kind of feel like we'll just wrap it up and then I'll go back to it. But if they wrap it up and it's 12 volumes, 14 volumes or something, then am I going to go, you know what? I just don't have time to read all that. But if you gave me sort of like, here's 5 volumes and it tells the whole story, and they're basically each one of them is an act, and end of each one is an act break, I'm going to go, yeah, okay, I'm into that.
Thing is, though, with East to West specifically, is at some point, if you don't like where the story is, you can just bail and feel fulfilled. Right? Like you don't have to, although the way they're constructing it very, I don't know if Jonathan Hickman ever has an outline per se, like a master, like a show Bible or a series Bible, because he's writing so many different things. Like I just don't know how he has the time to get that advanced. But then you look at something like East of West, or especially his other series he's doing, which is the Black Monday Murders, which we'll probably review on a future episode of this show. But that, like, you're like, he's got to have this planned out. It's so intricately woven, and especially East to West, like they're definitely heading towards an end game, and have been ratcheting that up little by little. So, but at the same time, if at some point, if East to West just isn't delivering, and I say this because I purchased and read the first 3 trade paperbacks over the course of a weekend. And then I ended up trading those in for like the hardcover sort of, omnibus 1. But like that, I remember thinking like, finishing that first volume, like, wow, they all end almost like, it's almost cinematic, right? Because when you put a movie in the theaters, and Kingsman 2, which we reviewed on another episode, is kind of the same way. Like you got to make it for both the people who have followed you and the story so far, but you also have to expect some people are going to pick this up and read it and not have any idea about what has come before. So it almost has to kind of feel like it's its own thing, so that if they decided to put it down, they're like, oh, well, that was fulfilling. And East to West kind of does that. It all definitely has an arc, but each volume sort of finishes in a way where you're like, if I don't read any more, I'll be satisfied and I could always pick it up later and jump back in. So don't forget that when you're kind of sort of thinking about the length of a series. Like another great example is Invincible, which has been running for forever. Yeah. And it's about 4 issues away from finally finishing. But I came into that because I'd always been intrigued. I'm like, well, that's interesting. But what it took, and Image was smart to kind of push this, or Robert Kirkman was smart to do this. There was an issue in one of the free Comic Book Day kind of Image sales where the first 2 pages were literally an infographic of everything that had happened into the series up until that point. So you have a nice baseline of stories, so that when you jump in, which is now you're like, good Lord, like 40 issues, 50 issues into this thing, by the time I jumped in, like you have a complete, you're familiar. So if they reference something, you're like, oh, that's that thing they mentioned on page 2. At the same time, you're sort of like, you're peppered with, if I ever go back and try to catch up on 50 issues up to this point, I kind of know which things I want to focus on. Because in that little infographic, I was like, oh, that looks interesting. Maybe one day I'll come back to this. But I can finish the run and never go back and still feel like I am a friend of that world. Like I know enough to know my way around that space.
Well, and that, I mean, and something we brought up in the last episode, that speaks to the perceived difference in one of the big two superhero publishers versus an indie like Image, whereas Invincible's running much more like Batman, where you could grab a volume of Batman and read it and be familiar with the characters and really like the story within that volume, and then just put it down and never pick up another volume of Batman. It's not, but I think with some of these titles like Black Science or East of West or Paper Girls, I don't know what it is that makes us assume that there is a grand arc to the story, but I definitely don't. And those are very particular because East of West, for example, is basically talking about the apocalypse. I mean, the four horsemen of the apocalypse are reborn as children in this time. Paper Girls, we're getting the girls stranded in a time that they don't understand. Black Science, they're getting stranded in a dimension they don't understand. Those are problems that feel like they need to be solved within the narrative, either this apocalypse has to come and be defeated, or it ends everything, or the girls have to find their way back to their own time, or they have to make peace in the future, or the dimensionauts of Black Science have to fix the things that they've destroyed, or they need to be destroyed. But there's I guess the beginning, we foresee the ending or possible endings within that beginning, whereas something like Invincible, it can kind of go any way. And honestly, that's one of the appealing things about Rocket Girl is once the problem of a future teenager with future tech goes back to 86 in Rocket Girl, I mean, they could just show like the adventures of Rocket Girl in 1986. I don't know that they really need to have a story arc that explains all the, what the Q engine is and blah, blah, blah. It's like, hey, just destroy it and then move on to your next story.
So you're saying like Rocket Girl could go on for another 10 to 15 years very comfortably if they wanted to.
They could pivot that story for sure and say, no, we're just telling any number of arcs within this conceit.
And Paper Girls could go on that long too, because what you've set up is the ability to follow those girls, into high school and beyond, kind of like Harry Potter. But I feel like at some point, do you really want them running around like as 30-year-old women trying to solve? Like, is that interesting to you?
Well,
they're young, part of the appeal. It sounds dirty and gross. I did not mean it to sound that way.
They're young is part of the tension of the plot. That they don't know very much. Like they're sort of like, we don't know what the adults know, but because the problem is real, they don't quite understand it by volume 3 that they are actually being pursued. And so that's they are being pursued by this sort of future army that we've seen in other episodes where these future people, the ones that have the interesting dialect where they speak in a kind of weird version of English and are in soldier attire, like in armor. So they've encountered those people, but they don't really understand that they specifically are being pursued. And we, the reader, do. So just setting it up like that makes it feel like, you gotta wrap that up. I mean, I just don't think that we're not, there's only so much of that breathless chase and escape kind of thing that you can do. It's the George Martin problem of like, if you set up this conflict in the beginning, you got to resolve that conflict, later. You put the gun on the shelf in Act 1, the gun has to go off in Act 3.
Yeah.
The Chekhov problem. So,
well, all that said, my pick this week is actually one that follows those rules very, very closely.
Excellent.
It's another Image release, big surprise. And it's actually, it's one that I kept an eye on and I'd seen, but I never really thought it would be for me until I picked up volume 1. And it's I Hate Fairyland, written and drawn by Scotty Young, or Scotty Young. I think it's Scotty Young. God help me.
I love this. Yes.
And so I Hate Fairyland. I've seen it, advertised. You see it in the shop all the time. Their covers are just always vibrant, candy colored, really, really interesting. So I finally, when I was in North Carolina back earlier this spring, I picked up volume 1 and was so just delighted by how goddamn fun it is and how like just completely messes with hundreds of years of fairy tale tropes at this point. It just flies right in the face of all of that. So I always like to tell people, like, it's the best cartoon Adult Swim has never run. Right. So like if you love like Rick and Morty and all those, like all the different things that Adult Swim has put out over the last 5 to 10 years, this would feel very comfortably in that area if it was animated, but it's not. And I actually like that it's not, even though like the drawings could literally leap off the page and as animations. I like that it's not, because the mechanism of how the story is told needs the panel, needs the grid, needs the page turns. Kind of the same way I don't like, this may surprise some, I really don't like the Rick and Morty comics. As much as I love the cartoon, like once you read it, you're like, oh, this just doesn't, even though the drawings are there, they look like they're supposed to look, the dialogue sounds right, it does not work as a comic in my mind. It's just, you lose a lot of what makes it work. And I think if you were to take I Hate Fairyland and put it on the screen as an animated movie or an animated show, just wouldn't feel the same. But again, very comfortable bedfellows. I'm actually going to focus on the illustration before I talk about the story. The illustration is just...
I was going to ask, like, I know a little bit about Scotty Young. Is he both the writer and illustrator of
Yes.
I Hate Fairyland? Okay.
Yeah, the coloring is by Jean-Francois Bellieu, and then lettering and design, cover design is by Nate Picos of Blambot. So, but yeah, Scotty Young, written and drawn. So like you get right out of the gate, you get that cohesion that you find where that's sort of that thing that happens when the author and the illustrator are one and the same. You get like the same vision executed on both sides. And then you can really do some really fun, punchy things with transitions, with cliffhangers. You're really seeing an execution of a story, soup to nuts, in the exact way that creator wanted you to see it. But in this case, like the coloring is just as important. The coloring is just unbelievably gorgeous. Like it's just every page looks like a candy box cover of some kind. Because as you know, or don't know, the whole idea is this little girl named Gertrude, in the very, very beginning, goes like any kid in a Narnia book or something, finds her way. She falls through the cracks and finds herself in fairyland, like this sort of all-encompassing, mashup of every fairy tale trope and character you can think of. It's kind of like South Park's Imagination Land, if you remember back during that run of episodes when they go to Imagination Land. Very similar. You don't actually see like name brand characters, like the Ninja Turtles aren't walking around, right? It's very much like a wizard and a trees who can talk to you, and a fairy godmother, and gotcha. a witch, and just different things like that. Although I will say, during Free Comic Book Day this year, Image did a one-shot called I Hate Image, where Gertrude actually has to go through the land of Image Comics to continue on her quest. So she passes by Savage Dragon and like the guy from Invincible, and so all of Image properties that were that the creators basically allowed to be licensed for that one-off are there. So it's kind of funny, and the cover is very much Gertrude in like one of her megalomaniac poses with like an axe or something, and all the Image characters are piled up dead underneath her. So it's really interesting. But she falls through the cracks, she goes into this world, and she's met by very much Dorothy Wizard of Oz style. She's met by this fairy godmother woman called Queen Claudia, and basically says she gets to go off on an adventure to go find her way out of fairyland and solve the puzzle and all those kinds of things. And she's assigned this sort of Jiminy Cricket mosquito fly character. He's some kind of insect. I can't quite tell what he is. I never know. But she's assigned, she's like, and Larry will help you. And Larry's hi Gertrude, I'll be your friend, and we'll help you on this adventure. And then that's the first 3 or 4 pages. They just set it up really quickly. Then you come to find out.
Is it set up like she is definitely trying to escape Fairyland? No, she's found herself in the spot and wants out?
She's there, but she has to go on this quest. Queen Claudia tells her, she's the queen went on to explain that there was a door back to her world. All Gertrude needed to do was find a key to unlock it. So her quest is to go find this key. Fast forward, and that was just the first 4 pages. Fast forward 27 years later, she's still there. And she physically doesn't age, but her mind does. So she's I think when she went there, she was 10. Now she's a 37-year-old woman who's still in a little girl's body, who's still stuck in this goddamn place and has just completely given all shits. She does not care. She completely flouts any tradition, anything. She's given up. I mean, she's still looking for the key, but she's kind of given up hope she's ever going to find it. So she's a complete drunk. She's just, she swears all the time. She ends up murdering characters on occasion. One of my favorite sort of devices that this does is at the beginning of each chapter, or in this case, the issues they use to create volume 1, there's a narrator character who's setting the stage for you. And then Gertrude, went on and dot, dot, dot. So the first one that you find that the one who was sort of narrating the beginning was this moon. So then the camera pans out and you see this moon and he's like narrating the story and Gertrude's flying by in like her little like magical boat that can fly. And the moon's still talking. She flips off the moon and the moon's like, I have to narrate. So she takes a bazooka and just destroys and kills the moon, kills all the stars just to shut them up. Right. So then every chapter, another narrator takes the place of the previous one and like starts off again. And she ends up murdering them somehow, some grisly way. So it goes through all these things. So the entire time she's just causing absolute crap. She's still vaguely interested in finding this key because she wants to get the hell out of there, but she's kind of given up hope at this point. Meanwhile, Larry, her little insect sidekick, is just as depressed and as angsty as you can possibly imagine. He's a chain smoker now. He's just constantly just like, he's given up too. So like Gertrude's about to make like, instead of like, her making a bad decision, he's like, oh no, Gertrude, you can't do that. He's just like, you're going to get blown up if you do this, right? She's like, I don't care. He's like, okay. He's completely resigned himself to the fact that he's going to be miserable, right along with her. So the story is really, again, takes that fairy tale kind of trope. And there's a bunch of different things. Like, she goes at one point, she makes a deal with like the witch in the forest so she can like, get closer to the key. That doesn't go well. So she murders like all of the witches, like, goblins and everything, and takes the key by force. So eventually, and I need to be careful because I don't want to get too spoilery. Eventually, Queen Claudia gets so annoyed by all this because she's like this, for 27 years, she's had to deal with Gertrude basically tearing her kingdom apart. She recruits another little girl who falls into fairyland, who's all wide-eyed and innocent. And she's like, you little girl, you can get back to your home too, but you must find the key. And then she tells Gertrude that there's this other little girl who's going to find the key first and try to basically stop Gertrude. Like, she's basically painted Gertrude as like the villain now that this little girl has to stop. So then Gertrude gets all angry and has to, at some point, again, this is kind of on the line of spoilery, but you'll still appreciate it. At some point, she goes to visit like the Lord of Darkness and makes a deal with him to try to get back home again too. So like all these things happen.
So like the Satan.
basically, yeah. She just goes and casually makes a deal with him. So Gertrude doesn't care. She can't really die, so she just constantly is like, just causing havoc. At the very end, though, and this is volume 1, and I think volume 3 comes out earlier next year, I believe. Volume 1 ends very definitively. There's something happens, and Gertrude's her first arc is completed.
Gotcha.
And so you could stop reading right there and be like, well, that was fun, but there's definitely more to come. And I can tell you, like, volume 2 is just as every bit as batshit crazy as volume 1, if not more so. So it goes through all these different, again, it weaves together so much. And I think kind of going back to that question of should you read single issues or should you read a trade paperback? Right. This, because of the nature of the story, it has to function like a book, has to function like a Grimm's fairy tale. So chapters, even though they came out as issues, are important. Like, you need to be able to immediately go to that next chapter until this part of the story is complete. So I would highly recommend, if you're thinking about it, don't test yourself with single issues. Commit to the full trade paperback, which again is priced cheaper. This one is $10. Online, I'm sure it's cheaper. Although I would say don't get digital. You need this. This needs to breathe as like a physical object. You need to kind of be overwhelmed by the art. And I think just because it is, it leans into storybook tropes, having it as a physical book in your hands kind of helps with that experience. I'm hoping when they get through 3 volumes, like they do like a storybook binded hardcover version that's like, just, it looks like it would be like one of those like classic, Grimm's fairy tale books, but it's this, it's the whole story start to finish.
I can actually tell you that's coming out on December 6th. Because as you were talking, I looked it up on Image, and they are advertising the I Hate Fairyland book 1 hardcover on December 6th. Oh my God.
Yeah. Is that now which volumes are in that?
I bet it's only the first 2, maybe. Let me click on it. Let me see if that, because it looks like the TPB volume 2 only comes out in December.
No, trade paperback volume 2 is out. 3 comes out.
Oh, 3 comes out in December. Yep.
Wait, but they are advertising. Oh, that was December last year. 2 came out.
Yep. Sorry, that's
what 3 comes out in October. Oh no, 3 comes out. So perfect timing. 3 comes out in 2 weeks.
And book 1 will be the single issues 1 through 10 with some extras, that hardcover.
Yeah, I'm definitely going to trade up for that. Because it's again one of those things when we talk about art, like just owning this,
Yeah.
just flipping through it and seeing the art is amazing. And it's just like
Yeah.
he got so, I mean, the characters that, again, I go back to the whole Adult Swim thing because he's able to, even without speech bubbles, you know exactly what that character is thinking at any given time.
Right.
Like it's very, the gestation, articulations and like the facial expressions and everything are so, again, they're just very, like, you can sense sarcasm whenever it's required.
Right.
You can sense, defeat or disgust or annoyance. Like, it's just, he plays into that really nicely.
Yeah, and I'm just from looking at what I've seen, looking up this book. I love the Adult Swim comparison because it is very cartoony art. Like it's not, we're not talking about like comic book style or any sort of realism style where it's
Oh God, no.
It's very much like a parody of children's art. The way that Gert is drawn. And I love what you said about, you're exactly right. You can tell exactly what is going on in that character's mind just from the expression on their face, because it is, heavily relies on those cartoon standards of like this, a frown means this, and this kind of smile with this kind of eyebrows means mischief, and, and like the tongue hanging out with the X's on the eyes. And it's like really heavily draws on that iconography, and it just looks fun and silly and awesome. So.
And they have a lot. There's definitely a sense of scale the whole time that I appreciate too. Like you can feel like the largeness of this world as she moves. And there's certain characters that are, 5 stories tall, and so when she's talking to them, like they do like a close up on her and then a wide shot to show like her scale compared to that character. So you always get a sense of, oh, this is a big world. This isn't just some little thing. There's a scope, a giant scope, that goes on and on and on, which is, it helps because as she's trying to find this key, if the world felt small, you'd feel like, well, is she just dumb? But like you realize, oh God, this thing it's almost infinite. It just keeps going. So for her to find this key, it's probably a little hard,
Now, would you say that story and art are just as equally important in this, or do you get the feeling that the story lacks in ways that the art makes up for, or something like that?
I think the story's fine, but I do know you can tell there are specific sequences that he has only because they were fun to draw and fun to see. So I think that the art, I think, is the anchor. The story itself, just the plot and the basic overall arc itself is very interesting. Obviously, you can't have any of this without that. It has to be in Fairyland. It has to be this girl. 27 years has to have passed. But I think just the art, I think, dictates a lot of where the story goes, because it's just a matter of like how. And honestly, I've in talking to different comics artists and working with some, like I've seen a lot of it is like, what are they interested in drawing at any given time? And even Jonathan Hickman has said that about Nick Dragata. He's like, Nick and I, because Nick illustrates East of West. Jonathan Hickman will say, it's very much a partnership. I'll ask Nick what he wants to draw. I'll tell him what I've kind of thought about story-wise, and we'll come up with a compromise. And to the point where there was an entire East of West issue that was completely silent. It was just purely an assassination attempt. And you just see that whole thing without any dialogue whatsoever. So it was like, clearly that was an issue that Nick Dragata like, I just want to draw that. And Hickman's like, okay, whatever you want to do. Because at some point you got to remember, especially with a lot of these illustrators, it's a lot of work goes into every panel. I think we sort of sometimes forget that when we're looking, especially at a trade paperback or something, like as you're going through, like you have to you stop and remind yourself, hey, every panel was drawn and colored, So at some point, an artist is going to get kind of sick and tired of drawing something that they're not super interested in or is not inspiring to them. So I think in this case, you definitely get that.
Well, and I think my question was kind of leading, because in that case where the writer is the artist, there's much more of a symbiosis there between story and art, where he can tell so much of the story through the art. Like he already knows how to do that. So it is kind of a leading question to ask if one overshadows the other. Was this, now you may have mentioned this as you talked about when you found it, but had you heard of this before? What led you to pick this up? Was it just pure reaction to the art?
I mean, every time you go to Image Comics and you see what their releases are for this week's Wednesday, release schedule or next week's, it's always been a cover that has come up. So I've been familiar of it just that way. And when you walk into a store, you can't help but notice it. It's so distinctive looking, and the colors are so very specifically, vibrant and everything that you can't help but see it. So it's always been there in the corner of my eye. And I think when I just walked into this particular store, it caught me in a way. And I think I saw volume 1 where I was like, you know what? This it just looked like an adult. I mean, I thought that at the time. This looks like an Adult Swim series for some reason. Interesting. And I think at some point, maybe I'm making this up, but I could have swore at some point somebody told me, like somebody who kind of knows me fairly well said, oh, if you like Rick and Morty, you'll love I Hate Fairyland.
Oh, okay.
And it just feels like
a good even if you went in imagining that was that's
I could have swore somebody said it, or I read that like on a Reddit forum somewhere where somebody mentioned it. That sort of stuck with me. So I was like, oh, but I'm so glad it did, because it's not something I would have intuitively picked up otherwise. I didn't realize how very adult. I mean, it's an adult story. It's not a kid's story. It's just, you will never find this in the kids section of a comic book store. If you do, that person needs to be put up there, because it's not meant for kids at all. I should have started with that, because this is not a kid's story.
I think it's pretty evident from the cover, the bloody battle axe with the little girl who's missing a tooth and hiding a bomb behind her back. And all the beaten up fairy tale characters around her. That cover. And what's funny is that because it's funny how much yours and my comic tastes overlap, and especially like when we're both into Image so much, but we get different titles. I've missed this every time. Mm-hmm. Like me just dialing it up right now just to see what you were talking about that's one of the great reasons that we do the show the way we do it, where we don't tell each other what we're talking about beforehand, is because I'm like, holy crap, I'm gonna go get this. This is awesome.
It's so worth it. It's so worth it. And then if you like it, get in volume 2. But like, if you want just the one-off experience, volume 1 is soup to nuts, exactly what you need. But it's so fun.
Now, have you gotten volume 2?
Yeah, I've gotten that, and I'm waiting. Again, it's kind of like they're not like us. I'm waiting for volume 3. I'm not going to read single issues. I think the single issues are stronger. Then they're not like us, but it's still, again, and you need to experience it like a fairy tale book, where there's, you read it in one sitting and then you're done until the next one comes out. So it's got to have that kind of feel to it. And again, the physicality of it, I think, makes a huge difference. But it's so much fun. Like, especially like I felt after last week at reviewing Pyongyang, which was an amazing book. It was a little heavy, a little too real. So I kind of wanted something this week that was, much more just fun, funny, just like kind of shows you how extreme this medium can be when you really want it to have some fun and go crazy. Again, I sound like a broken record, but as batshit crazy as Kingsman 1 was, this, you'll have the same feeling here, where you'll turn a page and just go, oh my God. Like, just, they don't, he doesn't pull any punches. Like, it's very much, anything could happen.
Well, do you think, I don't know. I already have my own form, like, kind of half-assed opinion on this. Like, it just looks like a book when we come out of a discussion of something like Paper Girls and that whole heavy discussion of like, how do you get into the whole story? How do you get into like 7 volumes that are already out? And does it actually have an arc and an ending and all that kind of stuff? This is really the opposite of that, where, it's almost, I would relate it maybe to Chew, which is one that I liked, even though it ran for a really long time, where you can grab volume 1, and then when volume 2 comes out, you might pick it up, you might not. It's not like you're going to feel like, oh, well, there was some personal conflict set in motion in the first one, and I have to get number 2. And, it just looks like a fun book to dip in and out of.
Yeah. Oh, totally. It's a good, again, after important reading,
right.
It's very much just a fun palate cleanser
palate cleanser.
And it's got, and that sounds like it's diminishing it. It's not. Like, it's beautiful to look. Like, you could just flip through it and not even read it and just, highlight certain pages and just like stare in awe at just how fun and imaginative it is. But it is, I will say, I reread it prior to this episode, just in anticipation of this, and it is very much just as fun the second time through as the first time through. So it's got a lot of repeat, I think, kind of reading, which is great. I was thinking about that the other day. Some of the books I have, while I love them, I'm like, I think I've gotten everything I need out of this. I don't know if I can read it again, just because that first time through was the surprise and shock of it was the value of that story. Whereas this is like, you could just, like a good fairy tale, you could go again and again through it and still find fine stuff. So he really did a great job. I can't wait to see what else he does when this is over.
That's very cool. And, just clicking on his bio on Image, I noticed that he was actually part of the adaptation of the Frank Baum Oz novels for Marvel. So he probably spent so much time dealing with like Wizard of Oz and that world that he really did hate Fairyland.
Yeah, that's a great point. I need to read into to more. But if you go to his website, scottyyoung.com, you'll see a bunch of his stuff. And like there's the sort of the header image is him drawing like Galactus and Superman and stuff. So his drawing style is very, very specific. I don't think he's one of those guys, some of those illustrators, from book to book, you're like, oh, they have a different gear. They can draw an entire book very differently than what they did before. I think this guy is very much like this style is definitively him. It's kind of like almost like a sort of half-cocked Dr. Seuss, but with its own sort of like, it's not Disney by any stretch of the imagination, but there's definitely sort of a kind of a classic sort of Dr. Seuss-y kind of feel to it. So.
Yeah, that's a great comparison. And I did just hop over to his website to see that. And there's a very Dr. Seuss machine that these characters are walking into, which is really, really cool and fun.
Yeah. And kind of maybe like a Calvin and Hobbesy vibe too, some of his stuff.
Yeah.
If you kind of look back at Calvin and Hobbes books, there's a similarity there too. So it's,
yeah. This is definitely the dark twist on that for sure.
Yes. Oh yes, clearly. But God, so pretty. Just I'm going to totally that hardcover when it comes out. I can't wait for that. That's all. That's all for me this week.
Great. Well, where can people find this podcast?
Well, they can find it on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, Pocket Casts. Look for the Todd and Taylor Show. Search for it. Tell your friends. You can also find us online. We are Find Us There on Twitter and Instagram. And, of course, findusthere.org is the website where you can find this and all our other podcasts. We do one called Wednesday in Westeros, where we talk about Game of Thrones. We do one called Fan Theories, where Emily and her now fiance chat about fan theories across different movies, books, different things like that. And we have just a bunch of other shows. Check us out, findusthere.org.
Sounds great. Taylor, I will catch you next week for another Coffee and Comics.